Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. So what I will talk about today is the broader field of deep tech startups. I know that the other speakers are a little bit more focused. I will be, in a sense, more generic because I will focus in this presentation on explaining why, from my perspective, managing what is a network of companies, I feel that a lot of the innovation and a lot of the great ideas and the potential for radical change, like the previous speaker mentioned, comes from deep tech startups. And so a bit of an introduction. First of all, this is what I'll talk about. I will try my best to define deep tech, a term that is thrown around quite a lot, and see how this could be relevant for the current context. Then I will try to look at whether deep tech is receiving more attention lately. Then I'd like to answer the question whether advanced technology is enough. I think you can probably guess it's not. So what else do we need? And then finally, why are startups the best type of actor, in my view, to drive progress? Certainly not the only type of actor, but maybe the best. So a bit of context, as Aika mentioned, I run the Innovation Network for Advanced Materials. This is a network based in Berlin. You can find us at the website inam.berlin, very intuitively. So what we aim to do is to bring together different types of organizations. These can be startups, very early stage startups from 1-2 people teams, all the way to large corporates, including Bosch, Sony, Continental, Infineon, and also research institutes and universities, and also more recently, investors. The key thing they have in common is that everyone has a passion or an interest in advanced materials. And so we understand that every single part of this link is important, right? Without universities, about 95% of the startups that we support would not exist because they generate, they come from universities. They come up with the ideas as part of their PhD or postdoc projects, and then they later on go to develop them into companies. Without the large corporates, the startups would have a hard time surviving because they need those collaborations, and they definitely need them early stage, and so on. So everybody in the network is crucial. And what we aim to do is support emerging technologies, early stage companies, so that they can really take off and scale up. And so we've been doing this for the last 5-6 years. We've noticed different things. We've noticed also different trends in Europe versus the US or Asia, and I'll briefly mention some of these in this presentation. And we now have over 70 members that are not just European, but we also have Asian companies, quite a few Japanese companies, quite a few startups from the US. So that gives us a bit of an insight into how things might be different outside of Europe, and what could we learn, what could we take away, and hopefully adapt to and try to implement here in Europe as well, so that things can progress a little faster. So I'd like to start with somewhat of a definition of deep tech, just so we know what we're talking about. I struggled to find one that would be the ultimate definition, because deep tech is a term that nowadays is used a lot. Some people define it, they say, well, if there's hardware, or if there's technology, if there's a material, for example, a new material, then that's deep tech. Others say, well, blockchain is also deep tech. So what I liked about this particular definition that I picked is that it highlights two things that a deep tech startup or deep tech technology has to have. It has to have science or engineering risk associated with it, and then there has to be an additional risk in proving a market demand or a market fit for that product. So you can see already, you can kind of guess that it's risky business. There's a lot of risk on different levels. First of all, will your technology do what you hope it'll do? And then will it actually solve a problem? Will it find a market fit? So if it has both of these and not just one, then it's deep tech. And I kind of tend to agree with that from what I'm observing at INAM as well. So why is that special then? Well, it's special because startups that are working in this field, they require more money to invest in more R&D, and I put more between brackets because in comparison, startups in software might require no R&D at all. So they require more money early on, right? So before they go to market, they have to go through this extended R&D phase before they even have a prototype, right? They need to hire more people on their technical team, which might cost them more. And they often need to think about their IP strategy very, very early on, which again might cost them more. So this is why networks like ours exist, but this is also why there needs to be more awareness, I think, at European level, at global level, that we can say such a thing as a deep tech startup is different than a regular startup, and they need to be supported in a different way, and there needs to be a different framework for it. So that sounds risky. So why would investors care? And what I find different from what I was doing before, so I don't have a background in deep tech, and I used to work for Google. And as part of my role in Google, I was working with startups in software. And when I made this transition a few years ago and I started to work for INAM, I noticed that there's a different framework within which deep tech startups operate, and they have support from different directions. First of all, they start off in academia, as I mentioned earlier, so they do benefit, at least in the lab testing, experimenting phase, from that. Then there seems to be a different type of public funding, whether it's European funding or more local government funding that is associated with science and scientific progress that startups in software may actually not have access to. So that might be one of the very few small benefits of starting a startup in deep tech versus in other areas, software services. And then there's the additional corporate R&D budget, which obviously doesn't all go to startups. That would be very nice, but some of it does when they do open their research gates and they're open to collaborating with early stage companies. And then of course there's venture capital and the venture capital part, and that's a big discussion of whether Europe is doing enough and whether there are enough investors in that field or not. And that's a whole separate conversation. But what is nice to see is that that budget that is going towards deep tech startups from the investment world is increasing year over year. And the other thing that's kind of nice to see is that US investors are becoming more and more interested in Europe. So overall, this is to say that it does sound like a risky investment and like a risky bet in general to say, okay, let's go for startups because they seem to, have a hard life and need quite a bit of support. But there is support. There is support coming from different directions, and that's also encouraging. So is deep tech receiving more attention? I think you will agree with me that it is, and especially because of the current situation we're in and why we're all online right now. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's not only softwares like Zoom and Microsoft Teams that are receiving attention, but also more science-based ventures as well. Not to mention climate change and other issues that are affecting us globally that are really highlighting the need for more focus on deep tech. So that's good. That's the positive side. The more, I don't want to say negative, but the less positive side is that Europe is still lagging behind. It's scaling up. So it seems that a lot of great ideas are generated in Europe in universities and spin-offs from universities, also in other companies and SMEs. But the scale-up process seems to be more tricky. There's more bureaucracy in Europe. Perhaps we don't yet have as deeply entrenched entrepreneurial culture as in the US. For whatever reason, Europe is still lagging behind. So one question is what could we do about that? I mean, we're not politicians, so we can't affect that, but what could we affect each of us at our own level? The most famous recent example and why maybe deep tech is more in focus is, of course, BioNTech. And I found this timeline of their funding to be quite interesting. Obviously, they existed for quite a while, and they received different types of public money, private money over time. But when they really took off, of course, was now, when there was a big need for their technology, and when it could be turned into something that was immediately necessary. So if we were to apply this model to other startups that are going through an extended R&D phase in the beginning and that don't quite find their market fit for a while, we could see why it sometimes might seem like it's hard for startups to take off. But another thing that I think this highlights is how important it is for public money to be there for startups that are doing something quite high risk, and why there's also a need for a stronger private investment ecosystem. And BioNTech now, as far as I know, decided to basically be more of a US company than a Europe company. So that's also an indicator that maybe the Europe ecosystem needs to be a little stronger, a little bit more attractive. So all this seems a bit pessimistic. I'll get to the optimistic part soon. I wanted to give you an example of a startup that we work with quite closely. That's maybe another example you should know, just to highlight that there are many, many startups in Europe that are working on very interesting technologies and very applicable with real life problems that they're solving that are yet to take off, that are yet to become the next unicorn. But the ideas are here. We just need to nurture them better. Ruby Nanomed is the Portuguese startup spin-off of the INAM laboratory in Braga. They work on non-invasive monitoring of cancer progression. Very advanced, very interesting technology. They're building a microfluidic device for isolating CTCs. And they're currently running preclinical trials. Obviously, an additional issue for startups working in medtech is all of the preclinical, clinical trials and so on that they need to go through. Nonetheless, we met Ruby Nanomed in 2017, I believe, 2018. And I would love to see progress happening a little bit faster here. One of the things they're saying is whenever they have to collaborate with corporates or even with SMEs, things are a bit slow. And they're always a bit slow, but a bit slow can mean a year and a half before a contract is signed. So to your question earlier, Ike, of what could we do? Is this collaboration between different types of actors important? It's important, and we need to be aware of how time is also of the essence. But then, okay, we have the advanced technologies. We have a lot of ideas. What else is important? It's important that these ideas get support, both from governments, universities, and investors. It would be great if there was something like a Europe-wide long-term R&D framework or approach. There's something like this in the US. There's something like this in China, for example, but I don't think we have anything at European level yet. And then on the startup side, it's very important that their technology should actually solve a real-world problem. We often have startups coming to INAM that have a technology looking for the problem that it's solving because there's a solution, but there's no particular problem. So as an example, we know that there are quite a lot of startups that are solving very real, very tangible, immediate problems. So these are three examples of startups that took off, well, initially started in an academic context, and then they're now getting traction, private money, and we see them creating products that are being sold. So that's an example of how they're not just interesting science, but they are solving actual problems. And I'd invite you to have a look at them later on. Kumovis is 3D printing medical devices, and they identified that that was an issue, that there was a need for small batch production of individualized medical devices. Stennen is a German startup that realized there was an issue in agriculture where there was a need for real-time soil analysis, but that wasn't being done, and that was holding back a lot of the production in agriculture. And they had a sensor that could do that, so that they implemented their sensor into something that actually looks very much like a shovel, and then people can use it directly without the need for a lab and the waiting time. And Fliptech is an Italian startup that makes printed electronics cheaper and more sustainable, two things that I think everybody needs, especially the sustainability part. And so they had in their research, they had come across technology that could do that. And so they turned that into a product, and they recently got private investment as well. So it is possible. It's not always the case that startups solve such clear, obvious problems, in which case they need to go back to the drawing board, maybe have about 100 interviews with people from the industry to figure out what could be the problem that they're solving. And if there is one there, then they need to act on that instead of creating technology for its own sake. Okay, so we have examples of startups that are doing this. We know that there is some level of support for them, although it could be better. The question that I also want to answer is, why are startups best fit to drive progress in deep tech? And in my view, from having worked in the corporate space, from working now in INAM with both corporates and startups, from having research institutes in our network as well, I think everyone plays a very, very important role. But startups have a few key elements that other types of organizations, in my view, don't have. I think on the one hand, if we look at this, I think a strong deep tech startup would sit somewhere here. They have a very strong technology, like some of the ones that I showed you earlier. They are producing something it's a thing that people actually want, so it's not an invented need. And in the best case scenario, they're actually solving a global challenge, whether that is something related to sustainability, whether that is, like in the example I showed you with Ruby Nanomed, working on a medical condition or an illness affecting millions. It is actually solving a big problem. The other thing that I think sets them apart from other types of organizations is that startups have a lot of passion, a lot of drive. Their teams are all in in these projects. They, in comparison to individuals within larger organizations, whether they're research institutes and or corporates, on average, because of course there are passionate people everywhere, but on average they seem to be much more passionate about their product. One of the reasons could be that their potential return on investment is also much higher if things do work out and they succeed. But that is generally what we're noticing: more passion, more dedication. And also the scientific curiosity part is there because they tend to come from a scientific organization to start with. They have this need to become financially sustainable. And I think we shouldn't underestimate how creative you can get and how strappy you can get when you're pushed for cash, essentially, when you need to find a way to pay the bills next month. You might come up with things much faster than if you're in a very stable organization that doesn't really pressure you to deliver very fast. Still, we have the passion, we have the drive. Are they the best type of actors to drive innovation? Other types of actors might be large companies, might be universities, so why not them? Again, I think everybody should work together. That would be the ideal world. But still, why not these other actors? On the one hand, we have research institutes and universities. In my view, they're absolutely great places, especially for these startups to start and definitely to collaborate with long term. But it is not within their objective, to be fair, to bring research to market, to bring technologies to market. The tech transfer centers might do that to some extent, but that's not really what universities are for, right? Whether it is because the incentives are different or whether because that's simply not their mission, it's not what they should be focusing on. The positive thing is that Europe has a very high percentage of science graduates, higher than the US actually, and we know there are many, many spin-offs coming from the universities I listed here, but also many, many more. However, they have a harder time spinning off than in the US, for instance, where the technology transfer centers are almost professional, most of them now, at generating startups. The other problem that they have is when it comes in Europe, what do you do with the IP? And that's always a big question, and that can take years to figure out. Some universities are much, much better than others. But we've had cases with some of the startups we work with where this held them back for a couple of years. Whereas in the US, it's quite normal to have a model where between 3 to 5% of your equity is given to the university, but then you figure out the IP issues much, much faster. So something like that doesn't really exist in Europe, and that holds startups back a bit. But the good news is there are more science graduates, so therefore the chance of strong spin-offs coming out of universities is also higher. If we look at large companies, there are a couple of reasons why maybe they are not always as fast when it comes to innovation as a startup might be. One is that new technologies, completely disruptive, radical changes, like you mentioned earlier, type of technologies, are disruptive not just for the world and for an industry, but for these large companies as well, right? They offset their existing products, supply chains, business models maybe. And so who in the company is incentivized enough to make that decision is another question. The other thing is how do large companies measure their growth and what time frame? If they are looking at short-term quarterly growth, then you are often going to prioritize incremental changes rather than radical ones, because you need to report to your stakeholders in 3 months, in 6 months, and if you were to disrupt everything, it might take a year or two before things go back up. And as I said, there may be less incentive at individual level. Like even if you're quite senior in a large company, what would be your reward for introducing a completely disruptive technology? On the other hand, if you're the CEO of a startup and you're doing that, you're taking a risk, but the return for you directly and for your small company will be very high if things work out.
Antonia, I just want to give you a heads up that we are past the 20 minutes mark.
Okay, this is almost my last line. And the final point is we see innovation coming from large companies, but we often see it coming through high-profile acquisitions, which actually means that it's still from startups, but then it gets acquired by large companies. So in conclusion, what I wanted to highlight is how important it is that we nurture our startups, that we take care of them, that if you are working for a university, a large company, an SME, you're aware of that is probably where a lot of the innovation comes from. That startups in deep tech often have strong technologies, very passionate teams, and a good product market fit, and that they do hold some advantages, at least over other types of organizations. If you'd like to keep in touch, or if you'd like to write me anything about this or about advanced materials companies or about anything else, I leave my email here. And happy to take any questions or anything you'd like to talk about. And I will stop sharing my screen because I cannot see you, I think, otherwise.
Thanks, Antonia, for this lovely overview. A really nice, coherent story. A great example of all the good work that you and the team are doing. I already see a question coming up from Anka. Anka, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Eike. And I enjoyed very much your presentation, Antonia. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is, because it's for the first time that I hear about the topics that you have spoken. I come from a research institute, but I'm curious, what is the area where you operate? Is it only Europe? Is it further than that? And when you mean Europe, what part
specifically?
Of Europe? Yes.
Yeah. So we are based in Germany. So we started off as mainly focused on, I would say, Germany and Central Europe. And we started with Humboldt University as one of our research partners and founding members. But then we expanded more and more. So in Europe, we work with companies from pretty much everywhere. Italy, Portugal are quite a big focus. But then also Denmark, also the Netherlands, really everywhere. And then we've expanded also in working with companies in the US and Asia. So we have no specific geographical focus. It just sort of happened because we're in Germany that we were more focused there.
It's also the case that with startups focusing on materials, you can't be too selective because there are not that much.
Yes.
So if you want to have a good quality of startups coming into the program, you need to go globally. And I think with all the Zoom and Teams type of technologies, it's easier to also become global.
Yeah, it was definitely easier. When we moved the programs online, we noticed that applications from the US just like tripled over 2 days.
So I saw a hand coming up from Julia.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I thought it was really interesting. My question is basically in American universities, it's pretty common to have an entity within the university that helps academic researchers basically grow their idea into something that could start to be a startup. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to know how common this is in Europe and how much difference you think it makes in the success of an idea in this particular stage.
Yeah, I think it makes all the difference. There are very strong technology transfer centers of universities also here in Europe, but there's not exactly a unified approach to how things are done. So some universities are stronger than others, and some countries are much better. The Nordic countries, I think, are much better. What I think where they're very helpful is in things that you might even take for granted, such as those first steps, how to think about funding, how to think about IP strategy, developing your business model, basically everything that is not the science that the scientists have covered. And now we started a program at INAM as well called Lab to Market, where we invited scientists to join for a 1-week intense program on exactly these topics that they usually don't have in their curriculum. And we saw a lot of applications from universities that are in Europe and that don't have strong tech transfer centers. So I think we need to learn from the US in this sense, because there's a lot more happening there. And there's a lot more processes in place and frameworks that are clear. Like, okay, you want to take your IP out of university, this is the process. You want this is it. And we don't have that as much across the board, I'd say.
If I may add to that, what we see in the Netherlands, that they started this academic startup competition. So it's a competition between all the technical and non-technical universities. They all bring in their best startups coming from the university. And then there's this competition. And then the winners, they get a trip to San Francisco to have, let's say, a 2-3 week program. So I think there's a strong incentive, or a growing incentive, at least in the Netherlands, to really push for a better process for creating the possibility for students and PhDs to start a new company. There's still a big difference between the different universities. I think the University of Delft, where we came from, they are really becoming more sophisticated in this. They already are active in this part for, 15 years. We have this incubator, Yes Delft. It's a dedicated organization, partly funded by the University of Delft, to facilitate this initial phase. So they have this co-sharing facility, they have mentors, they have all kinds of programs, same as what INAM is doing, dedicated for materials. So it's definitely becoming better, but still not, I think, same as we see in the US. One comment that I wanted to make, somewhere in your talk, you mentioned that as a startup, you need to be creative because you don't have the same budgets that a corporate have. I have a very nice example that some of my colleagues are working on today. So we create this nanoparticle printer, and then we also need to have a camera module in our, let's say, printing chamber. So it's at a raw vacuum, so it's a special condition. And then if we contact different companies to get a camera that is able to work in that condition, we get a quotation of, I don't know, 50,000 euros for such a camera. As a corporate, of course, you will apply for budget internally and maybe get it. But we can't afford 50,000 euros for such a camera. So what we did, we looked online for open source, let's say, do-it-yourself projects, and we find a design for a couple of tens of euros, basically, and we improved it. So we did some initial tests to improve it. And now we have a fully functional camera, even two in our printer, that are better than maybe the commercial 50,000 euro thing. And then we also shared our experience in upgrading this concept with other people, that they can also use it. So I think that's a very nice example that I thought of.
Yeah.
You mentioned this topic.
I thought you were going to say that you're selling cameras now, but
no. That's not what we are doing.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I meant. When you're constrained either by time or by money or by whatever other, you don't have people in your team, so you need to learn how to do something that you've never thought of doing. So it's yeah, and you also have probably fewer internal processes and restrictions internally that would delay things. So that helps.
What I also wanted to mention is that for a deep tech startup, it really takes time before you really understand how you fit into the economy, how you fit into this deep tech ecosystem, and which specific solution you are providing. In our case, we already know when we started in 2014 that nanoparticles, because they're changing properties, have an enormous amount of value or potential. But how let's say, fierce particle should take shape to make the best fit with what already is present, what other companies are doing. I think it took 4 to 5 years to really figure out what all the other stakeholders in this ecosystem are doing before we could really find out what we are doing. So that's also something that we need to keep in mind when people are really bringing deep technology to the market, that just figuring out what you should be doing also takes some time.
Definitely.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Antonia.
much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.